I always thought the worst day of my life would come with sirens, a storm, maybe some kind of cosmic warning from the sky. But the truth is, it was just a Thursday. Jamie had just made Macy's lunch, cut the crust off her PB&J like he always did, and kissed me goodbye before heading out for his usual run. I was folding laundry. That's what I was doing when the call came in. Folding socks. I remember because I dropped one and I never picked it back up. When the doctor said massive heart attack, I think I stopped breathing. But I didn't cry right away, not until I called my parents. And they said, word for word, "Oh no, today? But it's your sister's birthday." And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just grieving Jamie. I was grieving the version of my family I thought I had. This story isn't about blaming or bitterness. It's about what happens when life rips the floor out from under you, and the people you thought would catch you don't. It's about watching your own parents treat your husband's death like a financial opportunity. About a child who understood love better than most adults. About learning that boundaries aren't cold, they're necessary. It's about the invoice my daughter drew, an invoice that didn't ask for money, but for respect, for presence, for love. And yes, it changed everything. If you've ever been blindsided by loss, by silence, by the realization that some people just aren't who you needed them to be, this story is for you. And if you have a story, one that still sits heavy in your chest, one that you've been waiting to tell, don't keep it locked inside. Click the pinned comment, share it with us, anonymously. We'll help bring it to light with care. For every 1,000 views, we're donating $1 to support others who are rebuilding after life knocked the wind out of them. You've got a story. Let's make sure it's heard. When blood runs colder than strangers? I used to think that grief would bring people closer, that tragedy had a funny way of reminding everyone what mattered. But 2 days after Jamie died, my parents showed up, late, with leftover birthday cake. Not even a full cake either, just a plastic clamshell container with exactly 3 pieces of dry sheet cake, the kind with that bright blue frosting that stains your teeth and tastes like regret. My mom said, "We figured you could use something sweet." And my dad asked where the coffee was. No hug, no "how are you holding up?" Just sugar and silence. Meanwhile, Mr. Gregg from next door, who once called the HOA because Jamie built a shed 2 inches over regulation, came over that same night with a hot dish of mac and cheese. No words, just nodded, placed it gently on the counter, and sat beside Macy for hours while she cried. He didn't say a thing, just kept his hand on her shoulder. You think you know who'll show up. You think love will come wearing familiar faces. But sometimes love knocks in work boots and smells like cheddar. There's a comment someone left on a video like this that I'll never forget. It said, "Grief reveals character." And it's true. When things fall apart, people don't become someone else. They just stop pretending. That week, I stopped asking for comfort from people who made me feel colder. I started noticing who brought warmth without needing an invitation. And I learned that some people bring casseroles, others bring complications. Jamie used to say, "There's family, and then there's folks who feel like family." I never really understood that until I watched my parents walk out while Mr. Gregg stayed behind and reheated his own mac and cheese just so Macy could fall asleep to the smell of something familiar. That night taught me that comfort doesn't come from titles. It comes from presence. And presence is exactly what Macy gave me the next morning, with nothing more than a drawing and a little tape. The loudest love sometimes comes in lowercase. Jamie wasn't the kind of guy who lit up a room. He was the guy who made sure the light bulbs worked before you walked in. He didn't post motivational quotes on Instagram or talk about being present in some grand philosophical way, but he never missed a parent-teacher night. He fixed every squeaky bike in the neighborhood. He once baked 60 cupcakes from Macy's school fundraiser because I forgot to sign up, and he made them in school colors with little stars on top. The man couldn't spell fondant, but he sure knew how to use it. Every morning, while I was still brushing my teeth, he packed Macy's lunch, always with a note. Not long, not fancy, just a sentence, sometimes two. "You're my bright spot today." Or, "Knock 'em out, kiddo, but with kindness." She kept him in a shoebox under her bed. Still does. Jamie never needed a spotlight. He built his legacy in quiet minutes. In the way he tied Macy's shoes with double knots and always let her win at Uno, unless she cheated. Then he called her out, but still smiled doing it. That's the thing about people like Jamie. You don't always notice how much space they take up until they're gone. And then everything feels quieter, flatter, like someone took the color out of the day. And yet, in that silence, I kept hearing him. Not in words, but in the rituals he left behind. The lunch notes, the thermostat set just right, the half-fixed garden fence he swore he'd finish Saturday. Jamie's love wasn't loud, but it was steady and dependable and deeply, unshakably good. I used to wish he'd spoken up more, been more assertive. But now, I'm grateful he didn't waste words, because the ones he left behind still echo. When Macy brought me that drawing, the one that said everything my parents refused to, I realized she got that from him. That quiet clarity, that refusal to sugarcoat grief or pretend things were okay when they weren't. Turns out the loudest voice in our house belonged to the one who never raised his. You expect awkward at a funeral. People say weird things when they don't know what to say. He's in a better place. At least it was quick. You look great for someone who just lost her husband. You expect awkward at a funeral. People say weird things when they don't know what to say. He's in a better place. At least it was quick. You look great for someone who just lost her husband. But you don't expect your own parents to laugh about life insurance while the minister is still quoting scripture. There I was, clutching Macy's hand and trying to hold it together when I heard my dad whisper to my mom, "She's gonna be set for life, huh?" And she chuckled, like we were at a Dame show and just hit the bonus round. It was almost poetic in the worst way. I could still remember Jamie's last birthday. My parents had stood in our kitchen, toasting him with grocery store champagne and saying, "No matter what happens, we'll always be here for this family." Guess here meant 2 days late and empty-handed. I want to be fair. I do. I later found out my parents had lost a chunk of their retirement in some shady investment scheme. My mom even picked up part-time hours again at the floral shop. But while that might explain the anxiety, it doesn't excuse the audacity. That was the moment I stopped mourning privately and started protecting publicly. I don't know what it is about death that turns some people into accountants. Maybe it's the way grief makes us feel powerless and money feels like control. Or maybe it's just greed dressed in black. I started Googling after that. Turns out this isn't rare. Reddit has entire threads about families who didn't cry at the funeral, but sure asked for a copy of the will. I read about a woman whose aunt tried to invoice her for babysitting the deceased 10 years earlier. Another guy's brother showed up drunk and asked if the deceased's laptop was up for grabs. There's even a phrase for it, grief vultures. They circle the edges of your sorrow, waiting for you to be too numb to notice they're picking it clean. But I noticed. Jamie would have been disgusted. He used to say, the way people show up in your worst moments is who they really are. And standing there, in that room full of casseroles and polite condolences, my parents were smiling like someone just won the lottery. It hit me that they weren't mourning Jamie, they were inventorying him. That's when Macy slipped her hand out of mine and went to sit by herself in the corner. Later, I'd find out why. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was taking notes. And the next morning, she would deliver her own version of the eulogy. It came in crayon, and it said more than any adult in that room dared to say. We were still 2 days out from the burial. The sympathy cards were still unopened, and Macy had barely touched her cereal in 48 hours. That's when my father leaned across the kitchen table, buttered his toast like we were discussing the weather, and asked, "So, Jamie leave anything behind for the family?" I blinked. I said, "I am the family." He gave me that look, like I was being dramatic, like I didn't understand what he meant. What he meant, of course, was, did Jamie leave anything behind for them? It's strange. People will cry at your wedding, clap at your baby shower, and vanish into thin air until there's a check involved. That's when they come back, with questions, with calculations, with suggestions about what's fair. But no one asks about the unpaid labor, the late-night hospital runs, the emotional glue someone has to become when grief blows everything apart. Jamie didn't just leave behind money. He left behind bedtime stories that will never be told again, holiday traditions that only he knew how to make feel magical, a daughter who will graduate high school without his cheesy signs and off-key cheering. And I'm the one who's going to carry that weight. There's this thing called emotional labor, the invisible work we do to keep relationships running. It doesn't show up in a will. It doesn't get divided into percentages. But it's exhausting and it's real. I've done the math, and no check can cover 3 a.m. nightmares or explaining to an 8-year-old why her dad isn't coming back. So when my dad asked that question, what I wanted to say was, Jamie already gave us everything. The life insurance, that's not a reward, it's a receipt, a painful one, for years of shared love, now cut short. Instead, I stood up, looked him in the eye, and said, "You weren't here for the living. Don't try to cash in on the leaving." And that was the last time we discussed numbers. Because the real accounting, that came from someone else. Macy had been working on something, and the next morning she handed it to me with 2 words, "For them." Truth in crayon and courage in tiny print. Macy didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't slam doors or throw tantrums like kids in the movies do when their world breaks in half. She just listened. Listened while my father asked for a piece of something that wasn't his. Listened while my mother said things like, "We're family, Claire," with the same tone she used to ask if the ham needed more salt. Macy took it all in, quiet, steady, still. And then, the next morning, she handed me a folded piece of construction paper. "For them," she said. Then she went back to brushing her teeth like it was just another Tuesday. Inside was a drawing, titled in bright purple crayon, "Things That Matter." Underneath were little boxes, checkmarked and labeled like a receipt. Who sat with me the night Daddy didn't come home? Mommy. Who packed my lunch and remembered the napkin note? Mommy. Who tied my hair on the first day back at school? Mr. Gregg. Who told me I was still safe? Nobody else. At the bottom, she wrote, "Total due from Grandma and Grandpa, $0. Total owed to Mommy, all the love." It wasn't flashy. There were no legal terms or dollar signs, just feelings turned into facts. It was her truth, and she wrote it the only way an 8-year-old could, in colors and categories. But it hit harder than any courtroom testimony ever could. Psychologists say children often see things more clearly than adults. They're not caught up in social politeness or family politics. They don't care who's supposed to be what. They notice who's present, who's kind, who shows up. Macy noticed everything, and she translated that noticing into something no one in that room could argue with. It was poetic justice without the poetry, a truth bomb in bubble letters. My parents read it in silence, and for once, they had nothing to say. In that moment, the balance shifted. Macy wasn't just a grieving child. She became the mirror none of us could avoid. She called out the gap between title and action, and she did it without raising her voice. I've never been prouder, and I've never been more certain that Jamie's legacy lived on, not in a savings account, but in a little girl with a crayon and a spine of steel. I didn't scream. I didn't curse. I didn't flip the table, even though it was a hand-me-down from my mother and I've always hated the legs on it. I just made an appointment. And 2 days later, my parents received a formal letter from my lawyer stating, politely but firmly, that all communication going forward would be in writing, and that any requests regarding finances or contact with Macy would require prior consent. Within hours, I got an email from my mom. Subject line, "So cold." She wrote things like, "We didn't raise you to shut people out," and "We were just trying to help," and "This feels like a punishment." She attached their bank details, just in case I decided to send something back as a peace offering. I stared at the screen and thought, so this is how guilt gets dressed up for Sunday brunch. Funny how the people who wound you the deepest are often the first to say you're being cold once you start protecting yourself. It's a pattern I've noticed, and not just in my story. In so many families, the moment someone dares to say, "This hurt me," they're branded difficult, dramatic, distant. While the folks who caused the pain, they get to play the victim, the loving parents, the confused relatives who don't understand what went wrong. Here's what went wrong. They showed up with expectations, not compassion. They wanted inheritance before offering condolences. They made my grief feel like a negotiation. I didn't go no contact out of spite. I did it out of sanity. Setting boundaries doesn't make you cruel. It means you're tired of handing people the scissors they used to cut you. It means you've stopped explaining the wound to those who keep reopening it. And you know what? Silence can be louder than shouting when it comes from someone who used to beg to be heard. Macy understood that instinctively. She never once asked me to make them stop. She just stopped looking for them to start. That day, I told her, "You never have to let someone back in just because they miss the version of you who didn't say no." She nodded like she already knew. And then she went to her room to finish another drawing. But this one wasn't for them. It was for Jamie. Sometimes healing doesn't wear your last name. The night after I sent the no-contact letter, Macy asked if we could have Dad's casserole. Not the fancy kind with breadcrumbs or 5 cheeses. Jamie's was basic: shredded chicken, cream of mushroom soup, Elbro pasta, and a level of black pepper that would make a New Orleans chef flinch. But it was his, and it was ours. I pulled out the wrinkled index card he wrote the recipe on years ago. Folded 4 times, little grease marks at the corners, still smells like paprika. Macy smiled the second I opened the cupboard. Not because of the food, but because it meant we were keeping something. Something no one could touch, take, or twist. While it baked, she sat on the floor rereading one of Jamie's old lunchbox notes. "I'm proud of your big heart, kiddo. Use it gently, but don't let anyone shrink it." And then, "He was never loud, but he always made the house feel full." She was right, and that night, with the oven humming and 2 bowls of over-peppered pasta between us, it felt full again. A week later, I got an email from someone I hadn't heard from in over a decade. Jason, one of Jamie's college friends. They used to be roommates, the kind who duct-taped their fridge shut during finals and made up fake holidays just to get through exam season. Jason had seen the obituary online. He said, "Jamie used to talk about Macy like she was already president. If there's a way to help her keep flying, I want in." 3 days later, he launched the Jamie Bell Future Bright Scholarship Fund, a small yearly scholarship for girls who wanted to study science, art, or whatever made their hearts burn bright. The first donation came from a bakery in town. The second, from a teacher who never even met Jamie, but said she'd heard about his cupcakes. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something deeper: recognition, respect, roots. That's when I saw the comment someone left on our story online. Sometimes strangers do what blood wouldn't. And it stuck with me, because it's true. Healing doesn't always come from the people you expect. Sometimes it arrives in casserole form, or a handwritten check from someone who only knew Jamie as the guy who held the door open every day for 3 years. Love doesn't need a family tree. It just needs intention. That night, Macy taped Jamie's recipe card next to her bed. Said it smelled like dad days. I didn't cry, not in front of her, but I did whisper thank you to the empty hallway on my way back down the stairs. Because in that moment, I realized something. Jamie wasn't gone. He was just showing up in new ways, through people who remembered what real family looks like, even if they don't share your name. What's written in ink can expose what's written in people. When the lawyer handed me Jamie's will, it came in a plain envelope. No drama, no fanfare, just a quiet file from a quiet man. I expected numbers, maybe a note about our mortgage or the dusty old guitar he never actually learned to play. But tucked between the legal paragraphs and bank account details was a line written in Jamie's handwriting, underlined twice. And that's what Jamie saw. When the lawyer handed me Jamie's will, it came in a plain envelope, no drama, no fanfare, just a quiet file from a quiet man. I expected numbers, maybe a note about our mortgage or the dusty old guitar he never actually learned to play. But tucked between the legal paragraphs and bank account details was a line written in Jamie's handwriting, underlined twice. "This is for you and Macy. Only you two ever showed up." 8 words, and they hit like thunder. I'd spent weeks second-guessing myself, feeling guilty for cutting off my parents, wondering if grief had made me too sharp, too angry. But Jamie saw everything, even when he never said a word. That line was more than a parting gift. It was permission. It was proof that love isn't about genetics or holiday cards. It's about who shows up when you've got nothing to offer but silence and sadness and leftover casserole. It's funny, people think a will is just a way to divide money, but it's really a mirror. It reflects who mattered, who gave, who took, and who stood back pretending not to notice. I read that sentence out loud at the will reading. My parents sat stone-faced, no reaction, no rebuttal, because there's nothing to say when the truth is that clean. Macy looked up at me and whispered, "Daddy saw." And that's what this moment was. Not revenge, not retribution, just recognition. There's something deeply healing in being seen for what you carried. For every silent sacrifice, every night holding it together for someone else, every morning you got up and kept going, when no one clapped, no one called, and no one cared. Jamie's words reminded me that legacy isn't made of dollar signs. It's made of choices, of presence, of quiet acts that speak long after you're gone. The will didn't end anything. It began, the part where I stopped apologizing for needing to be treated with care and started living like someone who deserves it. Because Macy still needed me, and I still had one more thing to do. Sometimes the richest people die poor because wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in who misses you when you're gone. My parents came for money. They left with nothing but silence. Jamie left us with no mansion, no yachts, no stocks with his face on a billboard. But he left us with something far more valuable. Love that showed up, a daughter who sees truth like sunlight, and a legacy so solid, even grief couldn't shake it. They wanted the money. I kept the legacy. I kept the casserole recipe with too much pepper, the shoebox of napkin notes Macy still reads at bedtime, the neighbor who stayed when blood walked out, and the sentence Jamie underlined twice, "Only you two ever showed up." That line wasn't just a goodbye. It was a torch, and I plan to carry it every birthday, every science fair, every hard Tuesday when the house feels too quiet. Because family isn't who asks what they get when you're gone. It's who gives when you have nothing left. So if you've ever felt like Macy, the only one keeping count, drop a receipt in the comments. And if someone showed up for you when no one else did, tag them. Say thank you. Let them know they're the kind of rich that matters. We'll be back with more stories that speak truth, spark healing, and sometimes come with extra cheese on top. Your story might be next. Tell it anonymously through the pinned link. We'll carry it with care, and for every 1,000 views, we donate $1 to help others find light in the dark. Stories like this deserve to be heard, so let's keep telling them together.